And welcome back to the DMHDD Technology Summit. I'm so happy everyone's joining us this morning on a cold, wet, and kind of dreary day. I'm Holly Reif. I'm the Provider Relations Specialist for Assistive Technology. We are excited to have joining us this morning Julie Christensen. Sorry for that, Julie. Executive
Mouthful.
Director and Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Association of People Supporting Employment First, also known as APSE. If you enjoyed today's talk, please make sure you check out the APSE Pro Day on March 24th, 2022. For more information about the Pro Day, please see the recent email blast or the flyer under the Technology First Technology Events page. As a reminder, we will be recording and adding this session to our Technology Summit page after the session is complete. Please ensure you complete the Technology Summit survey, also found on the Summit's website, and post all questions to all panelists in the chat. Julie will answer them if time allows at the end of the session. Julie, take it away.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone, and apologies for the rocky start. Gremlins on a Thursday morning here. But again, I'm Julie Christensen, and I am with the Association of People Supporting Employment First, or APSE. And I'm so excited to be with you, albeit virtually. This is an event I know we've been talking about for quite some time. So it's exciting to be able to be here and talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing nationally in terms of the kind of intersection between tech first initiatives and employment first initiatives. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail. I really wanted to kind of set the stage for some of the trends that we're seeing, some of the lessons we're learning. I don't think we're far enough along in this space to say we have lessons learned in the past. We're still evolving. We're still figuring things out as we go along. And so it's great to be able to partner here with all of you who I would consider our mentors in the technology space. We know the employment space, and then there's the technology space, and somewhere in the middle, I think, is this magic that can happen that can bring technology together in new ways that ultimately can lead to better outcomes, employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So that's the goal. And so I want to just give a quick introduction to who APSE is, who we are as an organization for anyone who might not be aware. So we are a national organization, member-based, professional member-based association with 38 chapters. We do have members in every state in the country and all of the territories as well, which is exciting. And we work internationally in partnership with the World Association of Supported Employment. But here in the United States, we are the only national organization that focuses specifically on competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities, improving employment outcomes. That's what we've been doing since 1988, and that is the core of our commitment. And so just to kind of dig a little bit deeper, you see our vision, mission, and values. As a national organization, we do fundamentally believe that it's a core value that everyone can and should work, and that they have the dignity to determine their own career path. And so our work as a national organization, in collaboration with many others who are hard at work in this space as well, is to address barriers that get in the way of making that that outcome, that opportunity for self-determining a career path and participation in the workforce a reality for all people. I talked about competitive integrated employment, and so I just want to quickly break that down. What am I talking about when I say that phrase, and how does that play into the work of Employment First? So under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, competitive integrated employment was defined and kind of changed. Well, it didn't kind of, it changed the way we talk about employment. So it took a bunch of different concepts that we've been kind of working on in silos and put them all together and said, this is the outcome that we're looking for. We are looking for work that is paid the same benefits, same opportunities for people with disabilities as anyone else. We are looking at work that is integrated in the community, that people with disabilities have the opportunity to just be part of the general workforce, not relegated to only participating in the workforce in special programs that are designed for people with disabilities. And that there's opportunity for advancement. So when we think about employment, we want to go beyond just the check the box, I got a job. But we want to talk about career pathways, opportunities to grow, advance, learn, which includes failing, so the dignity of risk. We all fail in our careers, in our life, and we learn from that. We are able to figure out what we're good at, what we're not good at. We refine the skills where we need help. And so putting all of that together is really the ultimate goal of what we're looking for, which seems really kind of complicated. And I'm a visual person, so I want to present the concept of competitive integrated employment a different way, that also kind of speaks to the historical siloed nature of the work. So again, when we think about competitive employment, I'm really going to be talking about minimum wage, comparable wages, and that comes from existing law through the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that allows for people with disabilities to make below the federal minimum wage through 14C certificates. So that's the C in the CIE. Separately, when we talk about the integrated settings, being in a setting for people who are with and without disabilities, when we look at our Medicaid population, we've talked a lot in the space around integrated versus facility-based services, regardless of whether or not they're employment. But we have historically put a lot of our time and energy into facility-based services as opposed to really working to address barriers that keep people with disabilities from being able to have full access. And then the last piece being about employment. What do we mean by employment? So having a job, participating in the labor market. And we know that the outcomes for people with disabilities there's a significant gap. So what Employment First assumes, I view Employment First as a movement, fundamentally, that this is the gold standard. We want all of these things, and we have found pockets of success where we're really addressing the integrated employment piece, or maybe we're really addressing sub-minimum wages. We continue to try to increase the percentage of the working age population of people with disabilities, and we actually know that during the pandemic, we've seen historic rates of employment for people with disabilities, but still a significant gap. So we look at all of these, and under the kind of flag of Employment First, what we're saying is that when we are talking about publicly funded services and supports, employment needs to be the first outcome that we're looking at. We have to assume competency and work with individuals to wrap services and supports around ensuring that competitive integrated employment is an option. And that's a whole other presentation that I won't get into today, but just to give a little bit of a framework. The other piece I wanted to address early in the presentation, before we get into kind of the lessons we're learning in that intersectional space between technology, tech first, and employment first, is addressing equity. And so we know the last couple of years, this is not new information, but perhaps has risen to a new level of consciousness in terms of inequities across the country. And so to put that into this space of employment for people with disabilities, we know the disparities between people with disabilities and people without disabilities. If we layer in that next descriptor of looking at people with disabilities who are people of color, then the outcomes are even more significant, significantly low. And so we have to think about not just addressing barriers to employment, but ensuring that we are intentional in addressing people who have the most significant barriers to employment and doing everything within our ability to be able to make that happen. So as an organization, I'm so excited, and since I'm talking to Missouri, I'm sure many of you know my amazing colleague and friend and frankly mentor, Dwayne Shoemate, who's on our national board of directors. So shout out to Dwayne and the rest of our board for passing this declaration about equity, diversity, and inclusion as needing to be forefront in all of our work. And so I say that up front to say that as we talk through some of the things that we're seeing around the country in this intersectional space of tech first and employment first, that we always need to be digging a little bit deeper to make sure that we're not excluding populations that don't always have the same level of access and perhaps intentionality in our service system in reaching out and making sure that they're connected. So with that, let's dive into some of the things that we're seeing. So again, I mentioned I see employment first as a movement. That's my own personal philosophy. In some states, it's codified in law and it means very specific outcomes. But from National APSE's perspective, we are really focused on promoting the concept of employment first, meaningful employment, wages, and career advancement for people with disabilities. And so all of our work, be it through our professional development and training initiatives, our push for universal competencies and certification for job coaches and job developers, and then also our work to advance policy and support our grassroots efforts to support employment outcomes. All of that falls under the broader umbrella of making sure that we are working towards meaningful employment for people with disabilities. Where does Tech First fit in this? So y'all in Missouri are so far ahead of most of the country in terms of having kind of an organized approach to thinking about the use of technology and how it supports people with disabilities across the spectrum, not just employment. We know that. It's that intersection of tech first and employment first that I want to talk about today. But it's an area that APSE, we're still learning. We've been the employment first leaders. I feel very confident piece, but I'm especially thrilled to be able to talk with you all today because of the expertise you all bring in the tech first space. So as we're talking, I have my screen set up in a really stupid way, so I apologize. I can't actually see the chat at the moment, but I will be able to look through it a little bit later. I would love to see your comments and thoughts of how you see some of the concepts that I'm going to present from sort of an employment first lens, and what you know in your world and with your expertise in the tech first space that can help us even, raise the bar on the work. So we know there are many applications. So in universal design, concepts of universal design, the role of assistive technology has been transformative for people with disabilities. And that plays out in a couple of different ways. So we think often about the ways that technology can be an accommodation or an adaptive tool. Perhaps it's a way to address an access or mobility barrier. Often technology, particularly in this day and age, it is a critical piece of the rehabilitative process, assisting people to return to work, to retrain, to just approach the world in new and different ways. And then more recently, I think we've seen increased use of technology in sort of a school to work transition by really thinking about technology in the K-12 school system, but with real life implications being what we're thinking about. So how do we address that gap of technology and supports that are provided within the school space, but make sure that we have seamless transitions so that the technologies that we know have helped young people navigate the school system can follow them into their adult lives in the community, and at least APSI hopes in their careers and participation in the workforce. But there's other emerging uses, and these are the things that I want to talk about today in terms of sort of the employment first space. And the two pieces that I really want to focus on are the ways in which technology is increasingly becoming a standard tool for job development and job coaching, but also for professional development and training for our direct support staff. So those, I think, are really the emerging areas. And in some ways, as I was prepping for this presentation, I was thinking, well, you know, this kind of seems like a duh kind of a conversation in the midst of a pandemic where we all have pivoted. So here we are today. I am sitting on my couch in Maryland presenting to my screen, and I can't see any of you. You know, we've gotten used to this environment. But I do think it's a good exercise to kind of take a step back and say, okay, you know, we got here, we're now used to kind of the everyday life of virtual, but have we taken a step back to really think about, have we lost quality? Are there pieces and parts of us just kind of accepting this new normal we find ourselves in that causes us to need to step back and refine and think differently? And I apologize for my puppy. Hopefully he will go back to sleep. So to build on that, I love this particular quote that really speaks to the other side of the importance of work in our lives for people with and without disabilities. And it really is about the social aspect, the ability to feel like you're participating, that you belong. We know, you know, most adults, when we are introducing each other for the first time, getting to know someone, one of the first questions we ask is, well, what do you do for a living? It's an integral part of our identity and our day-to-day lives. And so we want to make sure that people with disabilities have exactly the same access. But what I think this quote goes on to say, and is something that I want to round out with, and hopefully we'll have some time for some discussion in chat, is where social isolation is a critical thing that we need to address, be it through the lens of use of technology, be it through the pathways, through employment first initiatives, but we need to think about the social aspects of the workplace, and that if they're not in place, we see poor performance, we see poor satisfaction, we see poor health outcomes, we see all of these other pieces that fall into place. And so I want to plant that seed of thinking about the social aspect of work and where technology is contributing to better outcomes, or potentially some cautionary pieces that we need to look at in ways that technology could potentially exacerbate social isolation. I don't think that's a word. I apologize. I'm going to keep talking. So thinking about the virtual support space. So supporting people with disabilities in the workforce, our job coaches, our job developers. So prior to the COVID pandemic, we had a workforce shortage crisis in our country for direct support professionals, of which employment support professionals are just a part of that broader category. And we thought about ways in which we could support job coaches in the field to try to increase that workforce. When COVID happened, when we first found ourselves in the midst of this crisis, and it obviously varies around the country, but we quickly found ourselves in this new sort of response and recovery situation where not only did we have this DSP workforce shortage, not only did we have a need to continue to support our job coaches in the field, but we now found ourselves in this really bizarre new normal that did not look like anything we had done before. And we had to figure it out as we went. And so I want to kind of take a quick pulse on how that has fundamentally changed the way the work is done. So APSI has been tracking the impact of the COVID pandemic on the service delivery system. And so this is looking at data from we surveyed folks for about 18 months. And so when we got to kind of the 1 year point, so June of 2021, and we asked folks to, how are you using remote and virtual supports? And it's an interesting piece it's an interesting piece to look at the shift, because there was use of technology in the employment supports space prior to the pandemic, but you can see that it shifted dramatically to becoming the norm. There's still, though, that percentage of folks out there who are not using technology to provide employment services and supports. And so we don't want to forget about them for two reasons. Because on one hand, it may be that there are barriers to access for technology, access to or not knowing how to utilize. That could be an area of concern that we want to continue to address. But the other piece is we simply don't know yet. We don't have the research yet. We're looking at it actively in the moment. What works and what doesn't work in a virtual environment. And so there's always going to be need for traditional face-to-face, hands-on supports for people with disabilities in the workplace. And we don't want to tip things to a point where we are so reliant on technology that we lose the opportunity to have that individual connection when that individual connection is needed. But what we do know is that our service delivery system has shifted. Virtual and remote supports are here. They are here to stay. And when you even dig a little bit deeper and ask about the future, we know that it's not going anywhere. This is our future. It's our current situation, it's our present, and it's our future. And so what are we going to do about that? And so part of the conversation that we're having as a national organization is to really look at the lessons that we're learning in real time. And so I'm going to start with just a couple of those. This particular piece of work comes from, I want to give a shout out to the Kessler Foundation for funding a Midwest initiative. This was pre-pandemic work, but it could not have happened at a better time because this work was underway when the pandemic hit, and it allowed for the lessons that we were learning to be quickly adapted and shared broadly. So what started as kind of a smaller Midwest project really grew very quickly in terms of its significance. So when that project started, when the Midwest project started, we asked a different question than what you see on screen. We were asking job coaches and job developers, their supervisors, how could you use technology to assist in supporting people in employment? We don't ask that question anymore. Now it's in what ways? And so I want to pose this question to all of you, because I would love to see comments in the chat when we get to that point in the presentation of ways that you're seeing technology being used, or ways that you can imagine as we go through some of these other examples of ways that we can expand on this work. But we found some successful practices in a couple areas. Of critical importance is how technology helps support people with disabilities themselves. And so we see that through remote job coaching and supports, through app assisted supports, through remote learning opportunities, skill development opportunities, but also we see successful practices in supporting the remote workforce, and the direct support professionals who are at the core of doing the work. So again, that slide I presented earlier on the challenges pre-pandemic and now, we don't have enough folks out in the field who are doing this work, and the ones that are out there doing it every day need better services and supports to help them do a better job. So those are kind of the two buckets that I'm going to talk a little bit about. So Iowa started a initiative really looking at job coaching and crisis intervention services using virtual supports, which again, in some ways, it feels like a, well, duh, in 2022, we're all doing this. But in 2019, we weren't. 2018, 2017, when this work was beginning. So some of the things that we started to see through doing this work was that there were some unintended consequences that actually helped change practice for the better. So what the Iowa project intended to do was to provide supports for job coaches and job developers on how to use remote services and supports. So think of FaceTime on your cell phone, right? So instead of a job coach having to get in a car and drive a couple of hours out into rural Iowa where they might be supporting somebody, instead they were looking at how to do that through, FaceTime, through Zoom, through other mechanisms. And so the pilot involved needing to figure out how to get technology in the hands of job coaches as well as employees with disabilities, but also thinking through, kind of the piece of how do we train people to use the technology most effectively. And so here's an example of, as the pilot continued, we saw that in the midst of the COVID pandemic, this young woman, Sabrina, was being supported at an Applebee's and was very stable in her employment. But her agency shut down in the middle of the pandemic. She lost her supports, and there was not another agency in the area that could take on continued support. So here was someone who was already working. She just needed occasional check-ins and supports. Maybe there's a change in protocols. I mean, goodness knows in the pandemic, we had to figure out different ways to sterilize things, and, just the world changed. And so, keeping employment was really the critical piece for Sabrina, but she didn't have a job coach available. Well, it turned out that we were able to connect her with a job coach who literally lived 100 miles away from her. And it was almost seamless because she had already been working with her current job coach, her local area service providers in this kind of virtual space. But we were able to connect her with a job coach who could work with her, even though that job coach lived really far away from her. And it allowed for her to continue to stay connected, to get the supports that she needed in the moment, to maintain her job. Also, she still had the ability, so I'm thinking back to that little snippet of blue of individuals who are saying no, they don't use virtual supports, because sometimes there's a higher level of support needed, and the job coach hopped in the car and drove that 100 miles and was able to do that. But this is a success story that we weren't anticipating. It was a situation of looking at, can we provide supports in the local area? But then all of a sudden it was realizing, oh, wait, this changes how we think about wait lists for services. If we can do more remotely, then we can reach people who don't have access to direct support professionals directly in their communities, but still can benefit from services and supports that they are eligible to receive. So that's one example. The other piece that the Iowa team really started to look at was just the sheer volume of resources that are out there. So I became intimately aware of the Job Accommodation Network during this project in new ways. They do an exceptional job of keeping an eye on apps that are available, but there's an app for everything. And one of the really exciting things to me about this is that it's also really empowering for workers with disabilities who are able to search for their own supports that suit their needs when they need them. So it's giving people with disabilities some additional ownership in their day-to-day lives. Sometimes you don't need a job coach to help you figure out, how to manage your schedule. There's technology that can help you do that. And so having that opportunity to get resources to people with disabilities themselves in an accessible way, something that perhaps is already in their back pocket, that addresses some of the barriers to employment. The other thing that started happening in the Iowa project was looking at how to create sort of remote work experiences and virtual career labs. This became a really interesting area that we quickly jumped on and connected folks with around when the pandemic happened, because when we could no longer go out into the community, we saw a huge need to be able to remote in to see different types of work environments, to think about different skill development that might need to happen. And we had already started this work in a virtual environment prior to the pandemic, which allowed us to really kind of hit the ground running when that needed to become the new norm. So that's another area. So we're still learning from all of this, but there are things that we know we have to continue to work to address. So technology, there needs to be a technology plan as part of career planning and job development and job coaching and follow on. For individuals who are receiving supports and for professionals who are providing those supports, we have to think about technology and plan for it, and make sure that we're not just using technology for technology's sake, but that we're really thinking about where technology meets a need, helps make our lives more efficient, helps people with disabilities be more independent and self-sufficient in the community. But we also need to kind of think about, do we have the right space in which to even do this work? We have to really think about employers and partner with employers in new ways. So, it is not an uncommon, particularly in a retail environment, space where you are asked as an employee to leave your cell phone in your locker, right? Like, don't have your cell phone on you when you are out on the floor. And yet when we are increasingly looking at technology as a way to connect with supports, be it apps or FaceTiming with your job coach or whatever it may be, we have to partner with employers to also think about how we change workplace rules and norms to allow technology to exist side by side and be a tool in the workplace, as opposed to being viewed as a distraction. And so that takes time. We have to find the right players who are willing to take these risks. And in some cases, I think, the COVID pandemic helped accelerate the ability to which we were able to utilize technology, because there really wasn't another choice. But prior to the pandemic, it really was finding, those pockets, those industry pockets or employers who are willing to say, yeah, we need to think about this a little bit differently. We also know that Wi-Fi access is not available everywhere. Broadband access to broadband is a challenge. even having cell phones that work. Are there hotspots needed? Are there extra costs for that? And what does that mean? So all of these pieces and parts play a factor, and I'm sure that those of you who are listening in today are tackling some of these areas in your own work as well. I want to quickly talk about the work that South Dakota did, because they really were focusing on remote supports for people with for the service professionals, sorry, for the job coaches and job developers. So this is a different twist on things. And at the time, again, pre-pandemic, in South Dakota, job coaches were really spread out and didn't have a lot of community in terms of just their own professional community. Being able to bounce questions off of other people, and access to immediate problem solving, brainstorming, getting new ideas, or just I need supports. And so in the South Dakota project, we looked at actually using text messaging as a way to create community. And that obviously has evolved over time and evolved dramatically in the midst of the COVID pandemic. But where it started was a couple of job coaches, doing some group texting that was moderated. So that was the critical piece. Somebody was kind of moderating and making sure that people felt comfortable and safe, because, again, 2018, 2019, this wasn't the norm. And then bringing everyone together in a Zoom environment to just debrief, to get to know people. I mean, as much as I think we're all a little bit, sick and tired of seeing faces on screens and hearing voices that feel very distant, we want to get back to in person. It's still a level of connection. And so using the technology that's available in new ways to help bring people together who otherwise would not have the opportunity to get to know each other became a really critical strategy that, when the COVID pandemic was in full swing, needed to be replicated quickly around the country in similar fashion. And so I want to give an example of just, kind of how this works. And in some ways I shake my head because I see, I see some of these things and think, well, why didn't we think of this before? But, here's an example of someone who texted to their group that their client has an interview but is afraid to talk on the phone. And in this case, the job coach didn't really know how to support that. And so they just sent a text message out to this group chat of other job coaches and got back some immediate responses. Well, hey, try practicing interviews with others, use pictures, use Zoom, practice on the phone. There's just all of this engagement. And then the original job coach who posted the question said, well, hey, thank you for that response. Here's what I actually ended up doing. I tried some of these things. And at the end of the day, that particular individual that was being served by that job coach got a job. And would it have happened without this? Who knows? But here was a situation where the job coach was trying to do everything in their power to support this individual overcome a barrier of not knowing how to kind of navigate in a phone interview, and had immediate access to people who were just like, well, try this and try that. And then the job coach was able to do that and support this individual in real time. And the outcome was a successful job. So, again, it seems so simple, and yet we weren't doing this work before. And then suddenly we had to. And so now we're kind of at this interesting cross section of needing to kind of take a step back again, because we didn't have the benefit during the pandemic of pilot programs where we had the supports of organizations like the Kessler Foundation, who are willing to put funding in place to help create infrastructure and to analyze and look at the effectiveness of things. In the real world, in the middle of the pandemic, we were just doing things and hoping for the best. And so now we kind of need to pause and think about, well, what worked and what didn't work? What are the lessons we're learning? So I'll keep coming back to that theme. So along the lines of bringing people to Zoom for the purposes of kind of debriefing and making connections, um, there was a realization that, oh, hey, guess what? We can also do training this way. Again, in 2022, it feels like, duh, I'm on trainings all the time online. But the traditional model was a training was held at such and such place, and you showed up there with 30 other people and did your training, and then went away and did your work. This particular piece of thinking about virtual training has actually completely changed the way that APSI as a national organization offers professional development and training for job coaches and job developers across the country. We're able to do so much more because it's so much more cost effective. But again, at what cost? At what point do we need to look at getting back together in person, which is really important for different learning styles. But in the meantime, we're able to provide more content more often, and really customize for what individuals need in ways that we were not able to do before, when training involved finding a big training space, sending a trainer with their, PowerPoint slides and whatever. We do this so differently now, and it really has had a lot of positive effect. Some of the things, though, that we continue to struggle with. So, again, these are lessons we're learning. We haven't figured them all out. When we're talking about online training, be it text message group chats or a Zoom room where we're doing live training, we have to think about, how many people does it make sense to have for the group to work? How do we engage people in this kind of virtual environment? How do we build relationships? Because relationship building is hard, and it's really hard when there's not a physical being there. It's just kind of a talking head. And then what's the etiquette around virtual? And so, 2 years ago, I would not be presenting with. He left now, but my puppy was sitting right behind me a second ago. But as we've transitioned to remote work and everybody working from home and doing the best that they can, we find that the culture of work has changed. But we need to have some intentional conversations about, well, what is etiquette? How do we operate in this new virtual world that we find ourselves? The next piece I wanted to talk about actually built on that work, and this is some work that took place in Ohio that is more concretely pandemic related. So building on the work that South Dakota did, what the Ohio project really looked at was, in the midst of the pandemic, what did the agency itself, employing job coaches and job developers, need to do differently to support working in these environments? So we kind of started in a space of, how does technology help people with disabilities themselves overcome barriers? We shifted to how does the use of technology, support job coaches and job developers who are helping people with disabilities enter the workforce? And now we're shifting into, I supervise those job coaches and job developers. And so what considerations do I need to take into mind? And so one of the things that this work kind of started with was, feeling pretty confident that there was a long list of services that could be delivered effectively remotely. We'd kind of gotten through the difficulty of the how, but how to scale that, and how to ensure that quality doesn't suffer when we shift to a virtual environment, really became the focus of kind of this next step. And so they in Ohio started to just kind of compile, what are some of the lessons that they were learning for job coaching, for job development. What about for job seeking or skills training? And just starting to keep track of what really creative, hardworking, ambitious job coaches and job developers were just trying to figure out on the fly, then management kind of needed to take a look at that and say, okay, so tell me what you are doing, and is there a way that we can better support this? And what does support mean? Does it mean funding? Does it mean we need better equipment? Does it mean we need more training? You know, how can we support these sort of grassroots efforts that we see are having an impact, and bring them to scale in an organized way? What came out of this was a recognition that remote work is hard. Whether you're a person with a disability or not, remote work is hard. And from a supervisory perspective, having that lack of face-to-face supervision made an impact. It's harder to assess when things aren't working well. You have to really build a level of trust and support, and quite frankly, a culture where there is dignity in risk, and it's okay to fail and to talk about it. Because if you're not seeing the people that you supervise on a day-to-day basis, and they're not feeling comfortable in raising their hand and saying, I'm really struggling with this, then that ultimately is going to impact outcomes. It's going to mean that people with disabilities are not going to get the highest quality services and supports that they need, and frankly, that they deserve. So that's something that agencies needed to adjust to. Lack of access to information, working at home and the distractions there. What are the rules of engagement? I just talked about that a second ago. And then I want to pivot back to the earlier comment about social isolation. Isolation is the word I'm looking for. And I'm going to come back to this again at the end of the presentation, but it's interesting the ways in which pivoting to a virtual space prior to the pandemic, particularly thinking about the South Dakota work that was being done, helped build community where it didn't exist before. And then during the pandemic, we really felt and continue to feel the impact of isolation, working at home, not being connected with other people physically, and the impact on mental health. And so it's both, right? Technology creates opportunity, and it also creates challenges that could have potentially long-term negative impacts if we're not careful in how we prepare and how we support people. So that really became a critical lesson learned. And so there are implications to this, to all of this, to kind of bring it home. So when we think about the practice piece, how to provide supports to support employment for people with disabilities. We have to plan differently. We have to train differently. We need to use our funding differently. We need to think about, you know, who is paying for the cell phone in someone's back pocket? I know I myself use my personal cell phone that I pay for, and 90% of the time, I'm using it for work, not for personal reasons. But I pay for that. It's my cell phone. It's not my company's cell phone, right? And I'm lucky because I can do that. What about workers who can't? And we're talking about job coaches and job developers who already don't make very much money to begin with. And then add on people with disabilities themselves, who we know tend to be in the lowest wage jobs. And so now we're kind of adding a tax in some respect to work, where they're taking on additional cost just for the benefit of being able to use technology. Is that the way we should be doing things? Or do we need to shift our funding models to make sure that tools and supports are available? That has happened in other areas. So I'm thinking of the assistive tech centers in every state that have free lending, you know, libraries, and make access to technology available for all types of different community living, independent living, rehabilitative type of work. We also need to think about that from the perspective of employment services and supports. I mentioned earlier, we need to train differently. We need to set rules and expectations. We need to set boundaries. In the remote job coaching work in Iowa, what became a really critical piece that we just didn't think about ahead of time was there's a cell phone involved in connecting job coach to job developer, um, the job coach could be getting a text at any time, perhaps outside of their working hours. How do you set boundaries around that? And then what is the impact on job coaches, on organizations? And one thing that I think is kind of a really interesting piece is that when you look at the minimum qualifications for job coaches and job developers, they don't always assess for, ask for, or require a minimum level of technology literacy, to be perfectly honest. When we started these pilots pre-pandemic, we thought the biggest challenge was going to be people with disabilities not knowing how to use the technology. That wasn't the reality that we experienced. It was the job coaches and job developers that didn't feel comfortable. And so do we need to think a little bit differently about the skills that we're looking for when we are recruiting people in to serve in this critical service area? There are also lots of policy implications. I've touched on them a little bit here and there, but thinking about our funding and our procedures, our service definitions in some ways need to change. It's interesting to me that one of the lessons learned during COVID was that Medicaid funded employment services and supports were a lot more flexible than vocational rehabilitation funded services and supports as a general statement across the country. And that's primarily because Medicaid was already in the space of telehealth. And so there was already a culture of thinking in the Medicaid services system that there is a use of technology and that we can fund that and we can bill for that. Vocational rehabilitation wasn't in that space, broadly speaking, and had to do some catch up during the pandemic. So sometimes it's even at that level. I mentioned access to technology itself, access to broadband, how we train, how we measure outcomes. And then oversight and management of the remote workforce is a critical piece. And making sure that our remote workforce has supports beyond just the day-to-day, but the mental health supports, the flexibility supports that they might need, particularly if they are navigating working from home and they have children or whatever issues are happening. We fundamentally have to do work differently as a country, and that comes with thinking through the policy implications of all of this as well. I'm going to wrap up in a second and find the chat because I can kind of see that there are comments and I want to make sure we can get to them. But I'm going to make a plug for, I know there's a lot of conversation in our country right now about when can we return to normal. And I don't want to return to normal. Normal wasn't working before for many people in this country. Normal before meant that only 35-ish% of the population of people with disabilities were in the workforce compared to over 70% for the general population. Those numbers have changed and evolved a little bit during the pandemic, but that gap, that was what we consider normal. I don't want to return to that. I want to think about the lessons we're continuing to learn, and again, that intersection between technology first, employment first. How do we do this differently? How do we break down barriers in new ways? Because we were not fundamentally, despite our best intentions, moving the needle. For 20, 25, 30 years, we hadn't moved the needle. And ironically, we have moved the needle in the past 2 years. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that technology has played a critical factor in that. We have to figure out how to use it better and to move forward in a way that is really building on the strengths of what we're learning in the moment and making that our new normal. And then the last piece I want to mention, and I've alluded to this a few times, is that technology itself can easily become a new barrier. Social isolation. I want to come back to that piece, not just for job coaches and job developers, but one of the concerns that APSI has really been raising anywhere and everywhere we can is that in some respects, technology, the use of technology and remote work itself has opened up opportunities for people with disabilities in the workforce in ways that didn't exist before. At some point, though, we have to really think about the implementation of that, because while being able to work from home on a computer is life-changing for some individuals, there's the risk that employers start to interpret that, well, if you're a person with a disability, I'll hire you, but you have to work from home because it's too costly, or it changes, the day-to-day in the office life too much to do the changes that need to be made to be a fully accessible workforce. And we have to actively guard against that, because my fear is that we become so reliant on technology, we become so enthralled with the advantages of work from home, that we create social isolation. I said it again, social isolation, in new ways. So in all of this effort that we have had to move people out of institutions, if someone, and I'm thinking specifically about my neighbor who lives across the street, is a person with a significant disability, he lives in the community, but he spends all of his time in his house with his only access to the outside world being through a computer. Is that inclusion? Is that what we really meant when we set out on this path to try to break down barriers for people with disabilities in being part of the workforce, being part of the community? We have to address that. I don't think we've tipped yet into an area where this is a crisis, but we can get there very quickly if we're not careful. So I did share this presentation with Holly. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the leads of the Iowa, South Dakota, and Ohio projects, and their information is here. So please feel free to reach out to them directly if there's something that you heard that you want to learn more about, or I know they would love to hear from you if there's something you feel you can add to the work that they're doing. That would be fantastic as well. So I wanted to make sure you had their information. I wanted to make sure that you had the information of the entire National APSI team, and ways to contact us. We are super excited to be having an in-person conference, yay, in June. In Denver, Colorado. And I know that technology and uses of technology in the employment space is a topic that we are going to have lots of presentations about. So it's a great place to continue this conversation. But with that, I'm going to, if I can figure out how to do it, stop sharing my screen in the hopes that I can find the chat. And try to answer any questions. And if Holly or others have been monitoring, if there are any questions that you guys saw, I would love to get those pointed out.
So we have some really great comments. The only question was concerning the texting program.
Yep.
And if there were any additional resources about that. How is that working with billing and documentation, and just kind of a little bit more surrounding that program?
Yeah, so in the slides, which I did see that question in there, and yes, you will get the slides. I really want to give a shout out to Wendy Parent Johnson, who is now at the University of Arizona, who has taken this work to just ridiculous levels. So the quick answer to the billing piece is that it's not per se a billable activity in the sense that, do you like think about it from the perspective of I'm in the office and I'm walking down the hallway and I poke my head into my coworker's office and say, hey, I haven't ever dealt with a client who, has difficulty on the phone. What strategies do you have? I mean, I don't know that we would have considered that a billable service as much as it's just increasing our own capacity as job coaches and job developers, right? So that really wasn't the priority of the project. It really was about creating networks and bringing people together to share ideas in the trenches. That being said, and Wendy is the person you really want to connect with on ways that she has really worked, particularly with vocational rehabilitation in some states, to think about how to fund um, kind of the moderation piece of things. So, we were able in this case to use Kessler Foundation funding so that Wendy herself was moderating the chats. Because sometimes it takes a little bit of that, right? Like, not everybody is ready to just jump in and, so where does that support come from? What supports can we provide for supervisors who can help play that role of thinking about the ways that technology becomes part of the job and part of supporting the job coaches and job developers who are out in the field.
Great.
And also at these resources. Okay, that was that question. Yep. Other questions or comments? See, this is the hard part of virtual stuff, because if we were in person, I imagine myself now going around the room, and if I happen to have a microphone in my hand, I'm shoving it in people's faces and saying, hey, what do you think? What's on your mind? Harder to do that in a virtual space. Other questions or comments or things I didn't talk about that you're seeing that are game changers? I will fully acknowledge that I'm selfishly motivated in being here today because APSE as a community, we're not the experts in the technology space. You guys are the experts, and so what can we learn from you? Coaching tools. Okay, so this question or comment about when you're using distance coaching and is the customer getting the support they need, is the gold question. Like, that is the gold star question. And the quick answer is that we don't yet have an answer, and it's why we need to continually monitor and check and just look at how we're using technology, not just kind of blindly do it because it's convenient. Because I do fundamentally believe that there are those situations in those cases that you just need face to face. So there's a little bit of give and take in these conversations, because what remote coaching has done is allowed greater autonomy for people with disabilities in the workplace. It's allowed job coaches to actually support more people. It's opened up supports in particularly in rural areas, folks on waiting lists. There's a lot of benefits, but at the same time, how do we even assess that when a message comes in whatever it does, that what's the red flag to say, ooh, you know what, this is one that I need to hop in the car and go address? I don't think we know that yet, and that's where we just need to keep having continued conversations. Because I will say that that's another cautionary tale that I put on the list, is that we know we have a direct support crisis. We know our systems are underfunded. It is cheaper and easier to do the work remotely, but may not be the best for outcomes, exactly to this point. And so we have to be thinking about the ways that we continue to message and protect the face-to-face interactions when they're needed, and to know how to talk about that and know how to justify that, and to make sure that that funding remains in place and that those supports for job coaches to make that call. You know, if you're being told we need to cut down costs, and I don't want to cover that, you know, however many miles per gallon it's going to take you to drive 100 miles across Iowa to support that person, that shouldn't be what we're talking about. What we should be talking about is, what is the issue at hand? What supports are needed? Is technology a good way to do that? Or is there something else we need to do that is more traditional, that is more hands-on, in person, and that it has to always be focused on the outcomes for people themselves? Oh, that's exciting. I was just reading Sandy Kaiser's comment. Why do you believe that getting the message across at the local board level has been so difficult? Um, I am percent certain I know what's meant by local board. So,
So in the state of Missouri, we have both state supported support coordination and services and local board services. And in a word, I would say training and accessible knowledge to what technologies can do. You
yeah,
know, we do an assessment to see if this individual is even comfortable using technology before we hand them a tablet and say, "Here, go for it," because that could be an equally, you know, big issue. If they don't know how to use it, it's going to sit on a shelf. So I think
yeah,
that comes down to a lot of education and, you know, planning.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for translating. Other thoughts or questions or comments?
We have some folks who are interested in attending your APSI conference in Denver and would like to learn more about how to get on the mailing list or where they could maybe Google to get more information. And Rick, I'm saying Google for you. I hope you don't mind.
Yep. So I just threw our website in the chat, where you can find more information about the conference, but also how to get on our mailing lists and all those good things. And you'll eventually get access to the slides that will have our email and contact information as well. So you're welcome to contact me or any of the other members of the team, or track down the great Dwayne Shoemate in Missouri, or Cassidy Job, or oh my goodness, there are so many amazing people in Missouri who are doing employment first work, which is what makes it so exciting to see, you know, a state that is really intentionally looking at that intersectionality, because that has to be where we go. So I'm grateful for the leadership in Missouri, in Ohio as well. It's super exciting, and we're learning a lot from it. Other questions or comments? Or do people need an early coffee break before your next breakout? I don't want to keep you unnecessarily. I hope this was helpful.
So I have another question about APSI membership and the benefits of being a member.
Yep. So we have several different levels of membership. So there's individual levels and then business levels, and so it kind of varies. From an individual perspective, we as a national organization try really, really hard to keep opportunities for professional development and training at low or no cost for our members. And so our membership dues help a little bit to offset that, but not entirely. We have funding in other ways. I would say what I love most about the APSI community is I've worked in a lot of different arenas. I've worked in government and higher ed and K-12. You name it, I've probably worked in that sector. The APSI community is so unique because these are the most mission and passion driven humans who work so incredibly hard, also know how to have fun, but ultimately really just want to support each other, um, and support the outcome of employment for people with disabilities. And so, I think I've actually changed a little bit how I answered this question over the course of the pandemic, because we found ourselves in a situation of crisis, and we're still not out of it. But we were able to really rally as a community, and find ways to share information and network and try things out. I think that's the other piece, is that the APSI community is very creative and very willing to try new things, and very willing to talk openly about when it doesn't go so well, which quite frankly are the conversations I want to have, because that's where the best learning happens. So, but that's just me. Not every community feels comfortable in that space, but particularly for this topic, it is so critical. So, I see the benefits of membership of really being about having access to this really vibrant community, connections to like-minded folks doing work in different states. Most of the work that I do a lot of the work on the policy side, is just connecting people. Like, here's work that's happening in Missouri. Well, here's work that's happening in Connecticut, and they're very different states, but sometimes we get so kind of caught up in our day-to-day lives that it's hard to innovate, because we're only able to innovate to the extent of what our experience throws at us. And so I see the true benefit of membership as being part of a larger community and movement, of just really passionate, talented, smart people who want to make employment a reality for everybody. And then there's some other fiscal benefits in terms of some of our bigger trainings, and but that's okay. Well, thank you all. We seem to be in the thank you wrap up mode of the chat. So you guys know how to find me, and find the team. Krista Rainwater is our membership director. She's amazing. She will talk to anyone. But I just so appreciate being part of this, and look forward to continuing to learn from all of you. Keep up the work that you're doing, and I know we'll continue to interact and share back and forth. So I'm grateful.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Yes, you too, everyone.